Hi, everyone. Welcome to the premiere of In Conversation, our one-on-one conversation with people in our community who are working to keep our Japanese American story, culture, and community alive. Our first guest is our good friend Satsuki Ina, who is a writer, activist, and licensed clinical psychotherapist based in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's also an award-winning filmmaker and the founding member co-chair of Tsuru for Solidarity, a direct action grassroots coalition formed to protest current policies that echo the racism and hate so resonant of the historical Japanese American incarceration. For over 30 years, she has spent her professional career seeking to understand the long-term impact of collective and historical trauma, and is here today to discuss my father's play, The Betrayed, and the long-lasting trauma the infamous loyalty questions and conflict has had on our community. Welcome, Satsuki.
Hi, thank you, Soji. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you. So last week, we featured the online premiere of my dad's play, The Betrayed, featuring real-life couple Helen Ota and Michael Palma. What was your reaction to the play? What did you think?
I loved it. I thought it was, I think, at first I thought it was going to be kind of a sweet love story that happens in camp, but the title gave it away. It really captured the complexity of what happened during World War II, particularly around the loyalty questionnaire. Not just the complexity at the time, but the way in which that traumatic double binding entanglement created by the government lasted through a person's lifetime, and from my observations, has lasted across generations. So it was powerful. I thought your father captured so many elements of the dynamic that was imposed on us.
So what do you think was his message? What was he trying to do with this play, do you think?
I thought he did a really incredible job of capturing how complex it was, how the Japanese American community was not this monolith of one kind of person, captured the different lives that people were forced to make sense out of each other, not just the rural and the urban, but really implications about generational differences, regional differences, and the corresponding values. So the message that was so powerful was the degree of trauma that it's not like the trauma of a bloody car accident, but a trauma that was like repeatedly hammered in many ways, forcing people to pick a perspective, pick a way of looking at their own story, and then having those perspectives collide and really bringing outcomes that, in this case, in some ways, were tragic and, even in the face of two people loving each other, the pull and the cruelty of the incarceration, actually programmed choices and unavoidable conflicts.
Let's go back to the actual conflict. What did it do to our community, these two questions that were asked?
It is, from my perspective, a classic circumstance of captivity trauma that the oppressor, the perpetrator, which was at that time the government, will deliberately want to fractionalize their victims, the prisoners, and calls fractures and splits that then get people to turn away from their anger towards the perpetrator and towards each other. They're powerless in the face of the perpetrators who have all the authority to direct their lives, but then easy to turn more against each other. And that loyalty questionnaire was, there were motives the government had for imposing that, but the process in which it was done got the outcome that they wanted, which was to disempower people more by blaming each other, venting their anger, their confusion, and that choice, that double-bind choice that people were forced to make, had a lasting impact on people's lives decades after the war.
So what did it do to relationships in camp as it was happening?
Well, it successfully tormented people, and it was no easy decision because it wasn't a circumstance that came out of the person's own choice. They were being forced to take a side or to take a stand, and depending on their circumstances, depending on their family dynamics, and even values, it caused huge divisions intergenerationally, across families, neighbors, friends, lovers. And the tragedy that I thought was brought out in the play was that loyalty questionnaire was based on a false premise. One, that a person's loyalty could be determined by just answering 2 questions on a piece of paper. And 2, the false premise that there was, in fact, an issue of disloyalty. This loyalty had never been an issue for the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated, but was, in fact, a crisis of their faith in their own government. And I think the 3rd false premise was that if you don't register, you will be fined $20,000 and go to prison for 10 years. That was a blatant, manipulative lie constructed by the government to coerce people by fear to sign and register that loyalty questionnaire. And in the end, of course, it was clear that there was no law that said you had to sign that registration form. So I think Grace's realization that all the consequences afterwards for her and for her family was a result of a falsely constructed way of looking at proving their loyalty. It's very tragic.
Yeah. Meanwhile, for the no-nos and their families, and as you mentioned, subsequent generations, how have they, first the no-nos themselves, but then how has the stigma and shame affected their families and other generations?
Yeah, and to me, this is one of the saddest consequences, besides the material losses, was the shame. I think there was shame generally for Japanese Americans, even though they were innocent, to be incarcerated. We are a collective system that values belonging. So to be cast out for any reason brings in itself a sense of shame. So finding ways to belong became, I think, an important focus or goal for people, not consciously, but I think in many ways unconsciously. To be a yes brought them some sense of aligning with power, and yes meant also that you would be willing to submit to being drafted, volunteer to fight for democracy in the war. And so it brought with it this kind of secondary sense of honor. And so then for the no-nos, there was a sense of belonging, of kind of righteous indignation. And there were, of course, many elements inside of that no group, just like there was that kind of complexity in the yes group too. So there was certainly the terrorist gang element that had been granted control by the authorities, essentially, to run amok. But most of the people who signed no were not those people who were using violent means to threaten people. Most of them, like my own parents, were people who were in despair. They had given up hope. And because they were Kibe, they had some roots in Japan and felt that it was a good alternative for them to not only say no out of protest, but to eventually renounce their citizenship as a place of safe harbor for them to be able to go back to Japan. So the stigma, of course, was targeted towards the no because if you said yes, you were aligned with the greater source of power, and the heroic efforts of the soldiers that went to war gave it this kind of honorable place in society. And to strengthen that, I think distancing themselves from no-nos, actually characterizing no-nos as opposites of yes people. So this is that dualistic double bind that was created by the government that we all as victims internalized, that there were good guys and there were bad guys. And the more you distanced from the bad guys, the more acceptable, the more the image of the goodness that we all were could be emphasized. So the consequences, the tragic consequences that I lived through my parents was the feeling that it was wrong to have said no, that it was this artificially constructed disloyalty, when in fact, resistance to oppression is a natural human response and is triggered at different levels in a person's experience. And I would say that most of the no-nos, I would say that all of the people who were no-nos were resistors. And some turned to more violent means of resistance, a smaller portion than the vast majority who found some integrity in their resistance. But after the war, they were so impoverished in terms of morale, finances, belongings, the possibilities of their future, that the stigma that they were on the wrong side of good cast this pall over their lives. And there was always this sense of shame and an extraordinary need to prove that they were in fact loyal Americans. One good example is in San Francisco in the Boy Scout troop. which is, Boy Scouts are kind of the epitome at that time of patriotic demonstration of democratic principles and honor and good behavior. So many of the Scoutmasters were Kibes, like my father, along with the Niseis, but many Kibes who, donned the uniforms, got their sons to don the uniforms. And I don't know that it was a conscious decision, but I would say for my father, it was a way to demonstrate that he had never, ever been truly disloyal to America.
So what about, the stigma? Our community certainly didn't help matters. In fact, made things worse. Members of our community who were yes, yes, really denigrated those who answered no, no, to the point where they felt, like you mentioned, shame, to the point where they didn't even talk about or identify who they were or what position they took. They just kind of stayed underground, if you will,
Right.
and never. So what kind of effect did this, coming from our own community, what kind of effect did that have?
I think the pressure after the war to be accepted, to belong, to fit back into mainstream America gave that distinction particular potence. That to prove, that Japanese Americans were good citizens, you had to denigrate. You had to really. I think it wasn't made up, but this was true sense of really hatred and disgust towards the people who said no, no, which was, a smaller percentage of the population. That shame was deeply internalized, and people had to deal with overt acts of, not being hired because they knew you were a no-no, not speaking to you, cutting you off, not allowing someone to marry someone who was a no-no, things like that. It was almost as if they, they were lepers, as untouchables. So people knew that they had to go underground with their history. And in the interviews that I conducted with men who said no, no, many of them said that their families had no idea, and that if I were going to publish anything, that their names were not to be mentioned. They did not want to be taped, videoed. So they lived with the shame, and yet there was a group of no-no men that came from all over different parts of the country to gather once every 5 years, or to reconnect, maybe to remind them of the integrity with which they resisted what they believed was wrong. But publicly, those same men were the ones whose wives even didn't know that they had said no, or had renounced their citizenship.
So if the wives didn't know, more than likely the kids didn't know either.
Right.
Until they maybe discovered it on their own or asked some probing questions. So what was it like? What was the effect on the sansei, the kids?
Yeah. So I think I think Donna Nagata captured this really well in the research that she did on the sanseis, that the sanseis felt that there was always some distance, we didn't call it a secret because we didn't know what it was, but there was a way in which the level of closeness or openness or sense of strong connection was destroyed is a kind of a strong word, but that contributed to this sense of cutoff from the parent. And we know that family secrets do that. That there's a way in which there's caution and limits and boundaries around what people can talk about, and even the depth of emotion that is kind of contracted when somebody holds a secret, particularly a secret that's associated with shame. And then you think about parents that want to be role models for their children, who want to guide them in a way and have the authority to guide them. If they carry with them this sense that they did something wrong, or that something was flawed about them, that they would do this kind of emotional arm's distance with the next generation. And Donna's research bore that out, that many sanseis talked about this kind of not knowing the parent. And then what we do as children, of course, is we personalize that. We make that mean something about us, that something is not quite right about us. So I think self-esteem issues, issues of comfort with intimacy and self-expression, wasn't modeled or encouraged in the household, and as a result had this impact of for sanseis to remain quiet, to constantly feel like they have to prove themselves, and particularly, I think that to some degree that was true for many of the people who were incarcerated, but particularly stigma, that is, some judgment from outside of the family, seemed to be kind of looming there even generations later.
So if this happened to the sansei when they had their own kids, the yonsei and new Hapa generation, how has that affected the next generation?
Well, I think there's, change that's happening. That many sanseis, after redress, it was like Pandora's box. They heard stories that they never knew about, and they were hearing niseis sharing some deeply painful experiences. And when reparations, the Civil Liberties Act was passed, there was this acknowledgement that made it possible for sanseis in particular to begin asking more questions, or doing more research, or diving deeper into it. So I think there was this more conscious awakening about what happened, and I think that for many people was shared with the fourth generation, but not, it's not like we could go to a class and have all of this explained to us. So I know that I have met with many yonseis who say that they always suffer from a feeling of not belonging. Part of it because they were Hapa, that they were biracial or multiracial, but also this feeling of never being good enough, that was underneath this constant pressure to have to succeed. I had many yonsei, young people who were suffering from depression and anxiety because they felt this incredible sense of pressure from their parents to be successful, to follow a specific narrow path that really didn't resonate for them personally, and the dilemma between letting their parents down and whether they were entitled to really express who they were. And I think that's the remnants of the trauma that was passed on. And also to say that in this yonsei generation, there is this opening, this potential that's being manifested now, where we are seeing more people, young people particularly, who are very comfortable with speaking out, participating in protests, standing as allies to other groups who are being targeted, along with more freedom for creative expression in the arts and theater and in writing. So I think there is this liberating process that's going on, but there's still this uncovering that needs to be done. And I think we're in the process, and bringing your father's play to the world today is part of that process. It's part of going back and understanding from a different perspective the more accurate narrative spoken in the voice of the victims themselves, that will give clarity to the conflicts and the issues that we didn't have as Sanseis, the clarity of understanding. I think I feel like I grew up in this fog of my parents' life experience in camp. And it's only in recent years that out of that fog comes this sense of pride, this sense of feeling that my parents had integrity. Not just that they suffered through the incarceration, but they had a sense of integrity that they had to suppress in order to be accepted within the JA community post-war.
Wow, that's quite a bit, quite a bit to unpack there as far as the really long-term ramifications. This whole thing, if you take it all the way back to the royalty issue, and then the consequences on the Nisei and how much pressure the Nonos felt to conform, to not stick out, to not reveal the shame, and therefore those pressures were put on their kids, and their kids put it onto their own kids, and they probably didn't realize where this was all coming from, but a lot of it stems from this trauma that happened to them during the war.
Yes.
Oh, wow. So what do you think needs to happen, for the so many of the Nisei are no longer with us, but the Sansei, the Yonsei, upcoming generations, for a healing, or what do you think needs to happen, or what are some steps people can take toward a healing?
Yeah, from a community perspective, I feel like we need more conversation with each other, and I feel like grace and tax conversation at the end when they meet each other at the reunion pilgrimage, and it's a great example of why pilgrimage is so important, where people come back and relearn the facts of what happened. But for today, it feels like these pilgrimages provide this opportunity. But we can also have community conversations, like the one that you're sparking by having the viewing of this play. I'm imagining that people will watch it and have conversations, and it would be lovely to have dialogue between these communities. And many people have talked about the movement within the JCL to apologize to the people who said no, and to the renunciants, which I think is an important step. And but to me, it's a symbolic and a kind of emotionally removed that you get an official apology from an organization. I think where true healing happens is when people are face to face, when they are in the room together, having conversations, sharing their stories. So Tsudu for Solidarity, one of the things that we do after we have an educational meeting, or a community conversation, or we protest somewhere, is we gather together And what we do is we share our stories without judgment, just to listen. Like, it would be so good for not just a yes family person to hear the no story, but for the no story to really hear how the family understands why the parents said yes as well. And so this play that your dad wrote, I think really points to that healing, that it is through not blaming and not getting caught up in trying to prove who was right and wrong, but to sit together and just listen to the human drama, the human tragedy that was suffered, that led to each person's decision one way or the other. I mean, it was a manipulation by the government that there was even a loyalty questionnaire. It was a manipulation of the government that people even renounced their citizenship. There's no sense that there was free will while you were incarcerated. And to understand that, it's like a triangle, you know, here's the perpetrator and here are the victims that have been fractioned and fighting about who's right and who's wrong. What we have to do is get rid of the perpetrator's narrative and just listen to each other. Sorry.
So, you know, how do you see what happened, you know, with this loyalty issue during World War II? And how do you compare it with what's happening today and protests that are going on? Do you see a similarity in what's happening, or a repeat of history, or how do you see it?
Well, you know, I think protest always triggers further oppression because it's a threat to the power structure. And yes, there is there's a way in which the power structure wants to, I mean, it strengthens their power to have the victims fighting with each other. And when you have leadership that's not prioritizing unity to solve the problems, but is in fact creating more division. This is very similar to what happened during World War II, that if you weren't protesting, then you got support and strength from the power structure. You were viewed as the good person. I think what's happened today, of course, is that it has really been reduced to the use of violence and against people who are protesting by the police and the military. So I was just talking to Wayne Collins, the son of the Wayne Collins that was such a, I don't know, a beacon of justice and democracy on behalf of the people who protested. And his statement about today's situation is that protest is democracy. That it is important that that we continue to use our voice. It is our right to do so, and it will be the role of the power structure to maintain their power by trying to oppress any kind of resistance. So is it happening today? Yes, very much. What is very exciting though, Soji, is how many young people are part of this resistance. How many young people see that injustice is being perpetrated and that they are willing to stand up and speak out with pride and with their knowledge about their civil rights in ways that I think my generation came forward by demanding redress, but in a personal way, I think we were all with great trepidation speaking out, and relied on parts of the white power structure to help support and move that protest along.
So in the context of today, you have these young people who are protesting. Can they see or can they view what in 1943 and throughout their lives as what it was, a form of protest and dissent?
I think more now than ever before. I think as the narrative is being taken away from the government's story about what was going on with the resistors and the no-nos, and people are more able to share the stories from the first person or from the descendants' point of view. I think that young people are more able to identify with the importance of resistance. And overall, I think my hope would be for our community is that there is mutual compassion for decisions that people made under horrible, oppressive circumstances, and that then we can move on to acting out the government's intention to divide us, and come to a true sense of unity and strength to push forward, a true democratic agenda for our country, for our children, our grandchildren.
So really, instead of this sense of shame and that they were bad people, can we now see them as an inspiration and a form of pride for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that has been my personal journey. When my parents, I was in college when they told me that they had renounced their citizenship, and it was the 60s, and I was at Berkeley during the free speech movement. So I had this instant moment of like, oh, that's really cool. You were protesting, but through time and with the heaviness of the government narrative about who my parents were, I think I always had this ambivalence. But today, with much more understanding of the broader picture, understanding the trauma that the generations have suffered, I have a great sense of pride and inspiration of my parents' decisions and the life that they chose. And in the same way that having people like your dad, your dad in many ways has become the icon, a hero in many ways, because he gave voice in this very poetic way. He through his art, I think he reaches a part of ourselves. It's not just the cognitive, intellectual, rational, fact-based story, but a heartfelt, an emotional level of meaning, of what that no and renunciation meant for him and others like him. And he is an inspiration for all of us, and his work has sparked the work of other people, younger people, older people like myself have been inspired
Indeed.
by it.
So Tack and Grace at the end of the play, they've met after 40 years. They've learned about the consequences and what they've gone through. There's a sense of there might be hope for reconciliation between them. We don't really know that, but if you continue to play out, it might happen. Do you have a similar kind of hope today?
Yeah, and I love how in the play they go back in time to their innocence, and innocence meaning that their love for each other just rose up out of their getting to know each other. But the split was caused by something external. The loyalty questionnaire, the forces of their parents and whatever it was came from the outside. And that in the play, in the moment at the end, you can see them reconnecting with that original love and caring for each other that never went away. And in that way, I think it gives hope, and it fits with the absolute hope and belief that we can repair the community fractures. We didn't create those fractures. Those fractures were imposed on us. And once we can shift from that way of looking at it, that means we can sit in a room and look at each other and say, I'm open to hearing what your story is. And once we do that, we have empathy. That is, we can step out of our kind of fixed perspective that we plaster onto each other into the more real moment, the moment that Tak and Grace express their love for each other. And I think that's really possible for us.
With that hope, I'd like to end this conversation. Thank you to you for all your sharing and all the work you're doing in our community. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you too, Soji. Thanks for making this happen, and thanks for carrying on the legacy of your father through your own work. You are an inspiration, and you have you are someone that, if you were a therapist, I had a kid. The father was in the room with me and said, "Tell Dr. Ina what you think about how you see Dr. Ina," and he said, Dr. Ice Pick. And he didn't mean that in a cruel way, but this is how I think about you, that you use your talent, your art, to go deep into something that feels frozen, something that has been rigid and fixed for many, many years. And I feel like your perspective, your not just sharing your dad's story, but writing your own story for us, is a way that you are getting deeper to the heart of what will heal us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that and saying that. And just really take care and have a very happy holiday season during this difficult time. But together, I think we can get through it.
That's right. And we all have to be safe, follow the health guidelines, and do what will get us out of this terrible trauma that we're experiencing today. Thank you, Soji.